Okay. Um, this talk will be about protecting, conserving native bees in Ohio. I'm a volunteer pollinator specialist, and what a volunteer pollinator specialist is it's a program through Ohio State entomology and the College of Food Agriculture and Environmental Science. Some of you may know Denise Ellsworth, the entomologist and program director for pollinator education. She's the one that led that program. And more recently, just finished up a class called Tending Nature. It was about native plants and biodiversity, another volunteer specialization. So I've always had a passion for protecting and building habitat for biodiversity. And so that's part of my background. Um, some of the things that I want to be talking about tonight, I'll kind of review native bee basics, and then we'll talk about their life cycle and how they overwinter, um, why we should care about that, what are some of the threats, what we can do to protect native bees in our own gardens or by volunteering in other places. So if you don't have a yard, you can go ahead and do a lot of volunteer work that will help also. We'll talk about planting native plants and why using native plants is so good for our native bees. And we'll explore other opportunities, some readings. We'll talk a little bit about some, what I guess I'm calling native bee basics. There are 20 to 30,000 species worldwide. So there's a lot of species of most people know about honeybees. So I'll be talking today about everything but honeybee. There's 4,000 species in North America. There's 500 species here in Ohio. And like I said, there's only one species of honeybee. So we'll be talking about everything but honeybees. So I put up a little poster of some of the honeybees or some of the bees, native bees that you will see, um, you could find in your backyard here in North America. Um, Anything from big carpenter bees to little sweat bees and mining bees. If you kind of look in the upper right, um, the poster, you'll see the big bee up there is the carpenter bee, and just above it, there are some little mining bees. So there's huge range of sizes and habits. The main thing that bees do is collect pollen in this picture. And then they have special hairs on called scopia that they have on their legs, and some of them have them on their bellies. And here you can see this bee has a big pollen ball on its legs. So that's one of the ways they use to provision their nest. And so some of the life cycle of native bees, their nesting and overwintering. Um, most native bees are solitary. They don't live in hives or colonies. There's one female bee that will make a nest, provision the nest, and lay eggs. 70% of them are ground nesters, so they nest right in the ground. 30% of them use hollow twigs, plant stems, or other abandoned burrows or tunnels in wood. Um, Females build their nest alone. They don't have any worker bees, or they do it all themselves. They construct and supply the individual cells. They lay one egg at a time. They'll provision it with pollen and nectar, then they'll close it up to protect it. Now, there's bumblebees have a little bit different lifestyle. Um, they do start a colony. An individual queen will start a colony. And then when she has her first offspring, they will become her worker bees. So there's a few different lifestyles of bees. Some bees are solitary. Most bees are solitary, um, but some bees will do what's called aggregate. You'll see a whole lot of them together, but they'll be each an individual bee nesting close together, but they'll each be making their own nest and provisioning it, and um, so they won't be sharing any of the work. They will, and that's called an aggregation. And some of them will nest what's called communally. Like you see the picture on the right, there could be two bees in there, but they'll both be doing provisioning their own nests, and so they won't be sharing the work. The only thing they're sharing is like the entranceway to their tunnel. And then you'll have Urosocial bees, and bumblebees are Urosocial, and so are the most common um, Urosocial bee is a um, honeybee, but they're not native. And then a little bit about the life cycle. Now, this happens to be the life cycle of a um, ground nesting um, uh, squash bee. Thank you. Um, they spend most of their time in the ground. Um, they start out as a larvae in an egg form, and they're underground for about 4 to 6 weeks. They spend most of their life in the pre-pupa stage, where they spend all winter long, um, and then they become pre-pupa and then adults. They emerge as adults usually in the spring, summertime. Um, the squash bee synchronizes its coming out with the bloom of squash plants. And okay, uh, we'll go to the next slide. So, just kind of an example of how squash bees work. The picture on the left, I took that last night, and you can see the uh, squash flowers are closed up. And the picture on the right, I took this morning, the flowers are open. Squash bees tend to fly in the morning. The males sometimes actually spend the night inside the flower. And in the morning, when they open up and the females come, it gives them an opportunity to mate. And those are called specialist bees, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I thought that was since I have the zucchini in the yard, I could kind of show you how that works. And then, uh, like I say, 30% of bees are stem nesters. So we can help those stem nesters along by the way we garden. And in the early spring, we can cut our stems off. I usually leave them 12 to 18 inches. And then in the summertime, the stem will grow up. The new shoots will come up about around the stems. I leave the stems up all winter um, to leave. Uh, Sometimes the birds like to come to the seeds that are left on the plants. And this is an example of what I'm talking about there. The picture on the left are stems that I cut early this spring, and the picture on the right is how it looked last night. You can see in the center of the picture on the right, that old stem is still there, but it's a place where bees can nest this year, stem nesting bees. So we're with the flowers, we want to provide them both with in the summertime with the nectar and the pollen they need. And then we also want to provide them a place to nest. And I've mentioned specialist bees. The picture on the right is a spring beauty bee. That picture was taken April 3rd at Bach Hollow State Nature Preserve. And if you notice, hopefully you can see it, the pink pollen on the spring beauty's legs. So the spring beauty bee has to time itself, hopefully with synchronization with the spring beauty flower, so they both can benefit from uh, the pollination services. The spring beauty bee gets pollen and nectar from the flower, and the flower gets pollinated from the bee. Um, there's another example of a specialist bee on the right, and it specializes in foxglove beard tongue a little later in the season in June. So adult bees are only active for 3 to 6 weeks. So they have to time, if they're a specialist, they have to time their emergence with, the flower or pollen that they specialize in. Um, Most bees, or a lot of bees, are what are called generalists. Generalists, they will, take pollen or nectar from just about any floral source they come upon. And bumblebees are like that. They tend to um, take resources from whatever they come to. I also wanted to point out some of the differences between bees and wasps and flies. They all can provide some pollination, but bees are by far the most effective pollinators because of their special pollen gathering hairs on the either on the legs or the stomach. But you can tell them apart fairly easily. Although some flies will mimic bees, and even some wasps will mimic um, a bee. But bees tend to be more stout looking. They tend to be hairy. The eyes are on the side of their head. If you look at the fly on the right, you can see he has much bigger eyes that take up most of his head. Um, Bees have two wings. Um, Flies only have one. Wasps have thin bodies. They don't have the big, thick bodies that bees have. So those are some of the characteristics where you can tell the difference between a bee and other insects. And then I wanted to talk about why we should care and conservation of um, native bees. Most flowering plants rely on pollination services of bees, including our fruits and our vegetables and nuts we eat. 80 to 90% of flowering plants on the planet rely on bees for pollination services. Bees are what are called a keystone species, which means they're a species upon which other species depend. In other words, no bees, no flowers, no pollination services for those. The flowers go away. Um, Bees are vital to maintaining healthy ecosystems. They're essential for plant reproduction and genetic diversity. And um, losses of biodiversity are clear signs that our own life support systems are in danger. So as we see bee species declining, we know the health of our planet is declining. Um, Humans cannot live as the only species on the planet. Every time we force a species to extinction, we promote our own demise. Um, Bees can live just fine without us, but we can't live without them. I'll talk a little bit more about keystone species later. I just want to talk a little bit about the energy food web. All energy starts with plants converting the energy from the sunlight through photosynthesis, and then those are transferred into the food web. And bees are a very important part of the complex food web. This is my drawing, so I'm not a super good artist, but we'll talk more about food webs also. Um, and then unfortunately, our uh, insects in general have lots of threats. And the diagram on the right was originally designed to show for monarch conservation, but it's the same thing for bees. We live in an area that has a high concentration of farming and urban development, so tons of habitat loss because of that. And like I say, the central region of the United States is in particular concerned because of all the farming and the use of pesticides on those farms. And so what can we do to help native bees and to protect them? And I like to say that this is where the fun starts for me, because it's I like to grow native plants and to work and volunteer. So we can plant native plants in our yards, and there's all kinds of continuums of, you can plant a small patch, or you can plant big patches. You can shrink your lawn and use that area to create habitat for pollinators. Bees depend on flowers for food. The nectar provides carbohydrates. That's how they fuel themselves to fly. And the pollen, it provides protein, and most of that goes into rearing their young. Flowerless landscapes and mowed lawns with strict weed control provide little food for bees. And so we can help that along. We can minimize or totally eliminate the use of pesticides and herbicides. Obviously, pesticides are very toxic to bees. And so some of the things we can do in our yards, we can do what's called plant keystone plants. And keystone plants are plants that support significant amounts of insects that form the foundation of our complex food web. And one of the best trees to plant are oaks. And so the picture on the right are 30 to 40-year-old oak trees planted in the summer of 1988. I planted those trees, but I didn't know that they were keystone trees. I just knew I liked trees. And then there's another concept, what we call soft landings. And soft landings are native plantings that you plant under other keystone species. So in an area like that, you don't mow it, and you let the leaves lie, and then you plant native plants under there. And so you're creating space. Bees tend to like to dig their nest on bare ground, so there's no turf in there. And so you're giving them their places where they can nest and overwinter. And so we want to plant native plants because they provide bees food and shelter. The plants absorb carbon dioxide from the air and sequester it and produce oxygen. They capture and store much more carbon than lawns do. They filter water. They require no fertilizers or pesticides. Usually after the first year, you don't have to water them. So if you're, not the most pristine gardener, they're great to use. They're essential to supporting all life by converting the sun's energy and passing it on to insects and other animals to eat and that depend on insects. This is an example of a native prairie planting, a demonstration garden that is at Sawmill Wetland. And most people have probably seen this diagram with the showing the deep roots that native prairie plants have. And the benefit of using plants like that is this is a diagram of your typical soil profile. But this is not what most of us have. This is typically in an urban environment, you don't have much of the ozone or the A zone, which is the most really important part of the soil profile. If you have a yard like mine, when they dug the basement, they put the B on top of the O and the A. So I need to work at it, and most people do too, to bring that soil profile back. So native plants with their native perennial plants, a good part of their root system dies back every year. And so in those spots where the roots were, it opens up places for water to go into the soil. Um, it provides um, humus and organic matter, and it also stores carbon, filters water, and slows runoff. So those native plants uh, are used to restore the soil that was there. Now it takes time, but we can do it. And then this is a diagram, a picture um, of the soil food web. And so once you get your healthy soil, you've got all kinds of little things going down in there, uh, plants and especially mycorrhizomes where um, it helps trees or other plants capture water and shit. And they also will share it around between themselves. Um, and then one of the other things that you can do to help our native bees uh, is to volunteer. You can share your knowledge and skills and time. There's a lot of opportunities to do that. Some of the things we do are on the left is a picture of a Buckeye Trail crew building trail in where was that? Do you remember? I'm trying to remember where we're building trail there. That was in yes, near Hocking State Forest. And then on the right, Sawmill Wetland Education Area, there were some AmeriCorps members there helping us do some work. And I was amazed on, they're young and they don't know what we know. So you can pass on a lot of great information to them and talk about, what we know and working to conserve um, bees. And then this is a picture. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back one. There are lots of volunteer opportunities around Columbus in Ohio, whether it's we volunteer at Chadwick Arboretum and Sawmill Wetland, Friends of Low Olentangy Watershed, ODNR, Metro Parks, and you learn a lot when you're doing that too. And this one I like. This is a demonstration prairie at Sawmill Wetland, and through the seasons, it provides great interest. I love in the wintertime when the stalks are standing and the snow falls on them. Obviously, we get big blooms in the summertime. Doesn't take much care. I think the only thing we do to this is every fall we cut it back to about a foot to 18 inches, and that's about it. It's a thick planting, so weeds don't grow in it. Every once in a while, we have to take out some woody invasives, but that's about it. So those types of this prairie at Sawmill Wetlands is something that pleases my eye. So I try to do something similar in my yard. Most people aren't going to garden quite the way I do, but I do it the way my eye likes it. And, I'm trying to put in as much ecosystem services as I can with the space I have. And that's why volunteering is good. If you run out space in your yard, you can volunteer and find some big spaces to work on. Sorry, the quality of this picture is not the greatest, but I have a friend who will use native plants, but they'll put them together in a more formal way. So if you want to see something a little more structured and formal, you can do it this way. You can kind of do it the way I do it, which I try to replicate what my eyeball sees in nature, or you can do it in any spectrum in between. You know, it's not a one size fits all type thing. For me, I've spent a lot of time wandering around in the woods and the prairies, and that's what my eyeball likes to see. And so these are another examples of, on the left is Petra's measuring a tree. I think she's hugging it there, but that's a 400-year-old white oak tree in Dysart Woods in eastern Ohio. It's probably one of the few uncut old growth forests in the state, but a 400-year-old tree is pretty impressive. And then on the right is a savanna prairie in it's in Madison County, I believe, is where that prairie is. But I like to get out in nature like that, so I know what it looks like. And then some suggested books and field guides and resources that I like to look at and use. Most people probably, or a lot of people are probably familiar with Doug Tallamay's writing. Both these books are excellent and great reads if you're interested in gardening for wildlife, native bees, butterflies, birds. And if you, Aldo Leopold's The Sand County Almanac and E.O. Wilson's Half Earth. If you read Tallamay's writing, in these books, you'll see that Tallamay was a fan of these guys, and a lot of their thoughts are in his thoughts. So he kind of put his books put these together in a little different light, but these are really great to read for some different perspectives. Finding the mother tree and braiding saltgrass is more of an indigenous look at nature, but both really excellent books. And then some field guides, The Bees in Your Backyard by Joe Wilson and Olivia Carroll. That was the class book we used for the volunteer pollinator specialist class. And then I have a couple of other field guides that I like on native bees, common bees of North America. They both say common bees of North America, but the one in the field guide in the middle is by Heather Holmes, and she uses both scientific and common names, which I like because I tend to migrate to the common names. The book on the field guide on the right, also Common Bees of Eastern North America, by Carroll and Wilson, they only use scientific names, which makes it a little tougher, but it has much more information, is a more detailed field guide. So I use them both and cross-reference them in between them. And finally, I would recommend anybody that's interested in the natural world to keep a naturalist notebook. I do it. I'm not the greatest writer, but it's just a little synopsis where you try to record what you see every day, what's in bloom, what bees are doing, what butterflies or birds you're seeing. where you hiked, where you biked, where you camped, and what you saw in those places. Um, so, anyways, that's my talk tonight. I hope you enjoyed it and it made some sense. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to try and answer them.
Thank you very much. Those were great pictures. And I love the idea of a naturalist notebook.
Well, I mean, what's I like about it is sometimes the next I don't know what I did the next day or the day before, but with this you keep a series. This is a 5-year one, so it's really fun to look back to see what was going on.
That's amazing. All right, everybody, I am opening up, looking at chat and looking for any questions that people may have had. I do have a question. So if you're just building up your yard and you're not really seeing the insect activity that you want to see, we'll put feeders out for birds. We might even put things out for small animals. But is there anything that we can put out artificially to start drawing while we're building it up?
Yeah, I have never done that. For me, the most important thing is the soil. In other words, you you got to kind of put your shovel in the soil and see what's there, and start planting. Like I say, native plants is what I would do. And normally, a native plant only takes a year or two to take hold and to start producing blooms. What I would say is, um, especially bees tend to be attracted to mass planting. So plant um, multiple plants of the same species, and like I say, they tend to be more attractive. Like I have um, common milkweed, and I tend to let it spread and uh, get pretty thick. A lot of people aren't going to like that because they go where they want. They tend not to go where you put them. But um, I've got masses of um, especially bumblebees on them, and lots of honeybees also. Somebody owes me honey, and I don't know where they're coming from.
Well, I do have a question from, are there a few key prairie plants you suggest are best to start with, both helpful to pollinators and easier to grow?
Okay. One of my favorites is a some people call them false sunflowers. I call them oxide sunflowers. And the reason I like those is that they're super easy to grow, and they bloom for a long time. Um, they're they are one of the early what I call summer bloomers, but they bloom all summer. So they're one of the most consistent and long-lived blooming plants that I grow. Um, like I say, common milkweed is actually one of my favorites, but they'll rhizome and they never stay where you plant them. So you kind of have to put up with some of that. Yeah. So that'd be my number one would be the oxeye sunflower.
All right, thank you. Marty asks, do you have any suggestions for 5 to 10 best native plants to help bees?
Um, I would say the first two would be common milkweed. The second would be the oxeye sunflower. Another really early spring one would be the foxglove. It attracts bees. It's a time when almost nothing else is blooming. The foxglove is blooming, and then later in the year would definitely be asters, whether it's New England aster, even goldenrod. Um, uh, uh, Another one I really like is, again, it's more of a Joe Pye weed. Um, Hang on, I'll think of it. No, not the compliment. Well, I mean, one of my favorite plants that just bloomed is your gray-headed coneflower. I haven't seen a ton of bees on it, but I just love the way it looks when it blooms. Like early is the penstemon, and the late would be just about any kind of aster. Bees go crazy over the asters in the fall. So those would be my.
I tried to write those out. They're now in the chat.
Okay.
All right.
I another aster that I really like is tall ironweed. Again, it's can be a little weedy, but it's just got a beautiful burgundy red.
When you say weedy, do you mean that it spreads, or that if it's not in flower, it looks like a weed?
No, they tend to grow where they want to grow. Like I'll plant milkweed or and it never stays where you plant it because it rhizomes, and I don't know how it gets everywhere it gets, but it moves around. But man, is it attract bees? It's a bee magnet. So that's what I mean.
Scott asks, I have heard a lot about No Mow May this year. Is that an effective way to help pollinators in early spring?
If you have like clover in your yard, if you just have bluegrass that herbicides have been used on it, it doesn't make any difference. But if you've got like dandelions or violets, especially violets and dandelions at that time of year, and clover is usually a little later in the spring. I don't know if clover is blooming profusely in May or not. I don't remember, but if you've got white clover in your yard, that's great bee food.
Okay, thank you. Deborah makes a comment that she loves the journal idea, and as a reminder to record the weather, because there are people who are looking at climate change in long-term journals. So get that data.
I record the weather, I record rainfall, and I record degree days. What's that? Yeah, I don't know if everybody knows what degree days are, and I'm not 100% sure, but Ohio State has a website, which I don't. Could you look at phenology, a phenology website where you can record every day. It tells you what your degree days are, and it's a measure of hours above 50 degrees, and which kind of tells you growing conditions. And every year it's a little bit different, but you can kind of tell from that what should be blooming, what's about to bloom, and so it just keeping a journal is a great way to make you a better observer. You'll pay more attention to what's going on in your yard, and I think it's probably just good for you to be more observant. So
that makes sense. All right, everybody, I put a link in chat, and what this is if you click on that link, it'll take you to the Westerville Library site and show you all the books that we have specifically on pollinators. So that will, and one other thing I'm about to put in here, we also have books on how to start nature journaling. So that is neat that we actually have books that tell you like how to get started if you don't know how to get started. So that's fun.
Yeah, it's really fun to do. It doesn't take much time, and if you're an artist, then maybe you can have another little journal where you sketch. I'm not much of an artist, so I sketch, but it's not flowers and insects and stuff. But anyways.
Okay, well, Joe, thank you very much. I loved the pictures. That hand-drawn food web was probably one of my favorite parts of this so far. You really know it
Okay.
if you can just sketch it out by hand. Good job.
Yeah.
But again, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for coming. And all right, everybody have a good evening.
Thanks.
Bye. And thank you, Petra.